for our live presentation and
Yeah, that's
benefit
fine.
from the recording. So,
Yeah.
um, like Steph said, it's good to have everyone here. I'm so excited that we're able to share what we've been developing, working on, and training clinicians to do. My role with Arise is really focused on the research component and the fidelity and efficacy and ultimately effectiveness of both the training and the delivery of the therapy to our clients. All of that is very important, and that's where my kind of area of expertise and focus is directed. I'm a clinical psychologist, so I've got some training to kind of support that and put me in a position to provide that service and resource. As far as today in the webinar, if there are any questions that kind of steer that direction, I'm going to be on standby. Steph's taking point on the presentation today, but I'll be on standby and available both in chat and after as appropriate to answer any questions folks have.
And we got our director, Kelly Buston, on the online too. And our designated adult is what I call her, Julia, because she keeps us all organized and on time, tries to her best. So today we're just gonna do a brief presentation, kind of like what is CMI? What are you guys doing and why is this even relevant or why should I be interested in this? Um, I'll try to get through it as quickly as possible because I want to make sure that we answer some of your questions you may have. Um, our our mission really as clinicians is to find the most efficient way of conceptualizing the work that we do. So as you know, like my previous role as an art trainer, I really got interested in memory consolidation, reconsolidation, and the whole theory and how the brain works and why does this work and why does it get stuck. So hopefully these are some things we don't have all the answers, of course. Um, Brian has a lot more answers than I do, so that's why I always refer to him. But I'm hoping that you guys get enough information to kind of grasp what CMI is and what we're doing with CMI. So as we described it with the definition, it's experiential psychotherapy, but we really use the clinician. The clinician is really what makes the difference. Our approach, our ability to hold space, our ability to attune, is what is providing the environment so that the individual can do this work internally. And so they kind of go on an internal journey, which is guided by the signals from the body. And we use sensory motion expansion. So I'll go a little bit more into that as the primary method. What this does is it helps individual really get to the root of what is driving behavior and responses. Uh, I kind of look at the body, the brain as like our default mode network or how we store memories, like this library of experiences, and everybody's library is different based off of where we were born, our family of origin, our culture, our experiences. And our brain makes sense of the world through that lens. And so part of the limitations that we had in therapy is that I'm looking at your experience, at least what you're sharing about it, but I'm interpreting it through my lens. And sometimes that can get in the way of effective therapy. And so we essentially wanted to find what is the most organic way that we digest experience, that we process information, and how can we guide individuals to do that so that they know how to do that themselves. And what has resulted of that is the work that we do with clients is much more efficient, much deeper. Um, it's pretty amazing to watch the changes. And this is not, we started off as like understanding how memory reconsolidation works in terms of trauma, but it's not just trauma. You can have an experience in childhood that's positive and it creates this like policy procedure manual that drives your behavior and it can be a positive thing, or sometimes it's useful and then later on it becomes outdated. So it's not just trauma memories. I want to make sure that I clarify that because this is about why we respond the way we do, and it's not limited to that. So critical memory integration approach is helping individuals access these points of reference that the brain uses that's driving the behavior. So there's significant experiences that shape our perception of reality, influence how we interpret situations, how we relate to the world, uh, how we relate to others, and most importantly, how we view ourselves, which is key point because I think that's one of the things that really differentiates when I use this approach versus some of the other approaches. Um, it was always difficult to, you can eliminate symptoms like flashbacks and nightmares, but the person might still have a lot of self-hatred or carry self-shame. And so that was always difficult to work with prior to CMI. So a critical memory. So think of memory not just as like a story that you remember. Memory is just data that's stored, right? And we know there's different types of memory, like episodic, semantic, um, what do we, the other types of memory. Brian will remember those better, but essentially like how you function, knowing how to walk, that's a memory in your body, right? But you don't recall learning how to walk. Learning how to talk, that's a memory too, but you don't recall learning how to talk. Uh, Remembering what happened in third grade, you might recall that as a story, but if you went through, like, let's say you were in the incubator whenever you were born because you were premature, your body will remember that, but you won't have necessarily like images or the episode to play back in your mind because unless you're one of those phenomenal people that can remember everything, because that part of your memory was not developed yet, and yet you still have the memory of it. So kind of think of memory as more expansive than just the story or the scene, right? So there's all types of memory, but those experiences, I call them an instance of an experience. Those experiences, somebody needs to be muted, sorry, I think. That's okay. I did the same thing last night in another meeting. So those experiences, there are some that you just go through and your brain is like, doesn't really put as much attention to. And some of them become a critical defining experience. And we never know. These could be related to trauma because trauma have a strong emotion component and survival component, right? But it could just be this moment of feeling detached, or it could be confusion or whatever it is. It can be all kinds of things. And for some reason, your brain takes that as a reference point to help you define who you are, your position in the world, right? Your worth, your self-worth, or how you're supposed to interact with other people. It can be any of those things. And that's where I think were the limitations before, where we were specifically seeking out like big T trauma or little T trauma, and we were missing all these other experiences that might be contributing to how we function. So the critical memory, think of that as the particular memories that really define how we view ourselves, how we interpret situations, how we interpret relationships, how we relate to others, like attachment. That is a critical memory because that is an experience that really, is solidified. We all know how attachment issues can interplay with how we pick partners and how we interact with other people. So these define our development, the attachment, survival, and the formation and maintenance of relationships, not just with other people, but also with experiences, how we define an experience. Um, Kind of that pessimistic versus optimistic. Something happens and one person sees it as a challenge, another person sees it as a barrier. Though all of those types. So you can even say your beliefs about the world. So these critical memories, these experiences define that. And they often evoke strong beliefs, intuitions, emotions, and reactions with very little input from our conscious mind. So a lot of these are subconscious or unconscious. And whenever we're looking at it from the lens of what we're aware, that's where we get stuck because we might think this is coming from here, but it's actually coming from over there. And this is why it's important that we're doing the work internally. But that's what a critical memory is. That's what we're referring to as a critical memory. It's differentiating from other types of memory because it drives us. It's kind of like our policy procedure manuals. So we perceive the problem as, so in CMI, we're not looking at the problem as like the event, right? So if any of you guys are familiar with like Gabor Mate's work, and he says it's not about what happened to you, it's about what happened inside of you as a result of what happened to you. So essentially, it's like how you interpreted that experience. And this is why some individuals, like if you guys ever like study like veteran PTSD rates, you could have 10 vets that go through the exact same experience, but only four of them develop PTSD and the other six don't. Right. So it's not the event itself. The event could be horrific and it could be, DSM traumatic defined, but how the individual responds is going to differ. And our theory is how they respond is impacted by these critical experiences, earlier childhood experiences. And we know a lot of those individuals, let's say veterans, for example, that develop PTSD have unresolved childhood trauma. Well, why does that impact how the brain processes or digests this experience? It's because earlier on we're learning how like our adaptive responses to stress, um, our capacity to experience like emotion or how we interpret situations. And so when we have earlier experiences that don't yet make sense with who we are, for example, for myself as a kid with my trauma, I became like pretty aggressive kid because being first generation Mexican American, not learning English, having a pretty um, a mom that had a lot of trauma that was raising me, it was constant defense mode, right? So that adaptive response made me think as a kid I was a bad kid. I wasn't a bad kid, I just was a very hurt kid, right? So as I worked through those things, I was able to differentiate my experiences, including how I responded to things, from who I am. And that's essentially what we're trying to do. If who I am is a kind, caring person, but I did all of these things that were not kind and caring, there's an incongruence there. There's a disconnect. And so that's where that shame comes in, the embarrassment, right? The lack of self-compassion. And we get stuck in these loops and we feel lost and like kind of like I don't even know who I am. If any of you guys work with trauma, it's probably something that you've heard often when a client comes in. I just had that yesterday. Um, so our theory is there's these earlier life experiences that at the time you didn't have the capacity to quite understand or digest, is what I call it, because it's a process. And so we're helping them get back to the root, re-experience, and connect to what we call the core self. Uh, Kind of give it a different perspective, right? So think of those as like separate. One of my clients yesterday, I did an intake and she was saying, I feel like my sense of self is like all these puzzles, but all the pieces are scattered. None of them, so I have no image of what actually I am, which I thought was a beautiful metaphor because it's exactly what we're trying to do with CMI is a lot of times we scatter those pieces because that piece is too painful to look at, right? It had a lot of sensory experience or a lot of pain and grief, and I just didn't know how to digest that at the time. But we need to go back and be able to reopen that memory network to be able to connect it to our sense of self. So essentially, by integration, we mean connecting those puzzle pieces of experience, right? So the unintegrated ones cause us to respond in a way that might not be congruent with who we are. This is where you might get someone who actually at the deep is disturbed by something, but they do the people pleasing, right? Instead of speaking the truth about how they're experiencing something. Or they might come to a challenging situation and they get aggressive instead of just assertive. They have a hard time kind of measuring their response. So these are the outcomes as a result of unintegrated experiences is I don't know how to be other than what I did to survive. And so this can cause a lot of, feelings of self-hatred, shame. Sometimes our brain is trying to figure something out and it'll play the scenario over and over again. We know that as a flashback, right? Sometimes it shows up as in our dreams because, the brain's like, oh, you're relaxed now. You're finally paying attention. Let me show you what the problem is. And it becomes a nightmare. So all of these, what in mental health we typically consider symptoms, in CMI, we're looking at them as signals that are going to get us to the root of the issue. And our goal is to integrate a meaning, make all of these connections so the individual can see the whole picture of who they are. So integration, the meaning itself is to connect or make whole. So that's why I thought it was beautiful the way this lady described her sense of self is like scattered puzzle pieces, which is exactly the image that I get here. And in that sense, we talk about integrity, like, hey, it's, being able to do or decide who you're going to be regardless of the circumstance. But how we achieve that depends on how integrated we are, how well we are, uh, how solid of a sense of self we have, right? So this is part of the goal. Part of the outcomes also as a result of this work is that individuals feel more connected, more aware, more in control, a sense of agency over their life, control over their life. So how do we even come up with this? Like, I can tell you there's nothing new under the sun in terms of treatment, right? There's so many modalities out there and there's so many amazing approaches. Um, that I think for like a new graduate, I remember when I first got out of school, I didn't even know where to start. What do I learn and why do I learn that? And these people are touting that intervention, these people are touting that intervention. And part of what I wanted to understand and our team wanted to understand, how does all of this interplay? Can we find essentially like a universal truth? And so what's beautiful is as we go through training, we'll have someone who like specializes in EMDR and says, "Oh, CMI is just like EMDR." Or they specialize in IFS and they're like, "Oh, this is just like IFS." Or acceptance and commitment therapy and they're like, "Oh, this is just like acceptance and commitment therapy." It is like all of them, but yet it's its own thing, because we informed the process. It's informed through all of these approaches. So we kind of took like, I think we started with 30 modalities and then we dwindled it down to about 15 and just charted what is the mechanism of action? What are the theories that drive this approach? What are the results? What's the theory about why this might have worked? Because if any of you have been trained in a modality that touts this is the only way, that's not true. It works for a lot of people, but there's always the outliers that it either goes the opposite or it just doesn't work, right? So those are the questions that were driving us. And so we bring all of these theories, and approaches together to see where is that universal truth? Where is that center thing that helps us see why all of these pieces work? And we also looked at, well, how does memory work, right? What's the neurobiology behind behavior? What happens? What drives behavior? How does emotions work? Why are they important? All of these pieces we were considering and kind of layering together. So as you can imagine, it's been quite a bit of work. In trying to sift through all of this and figure out how can we use that information to come up with kind of a pattern or an algorithm, if you will, that'll help individuals better understand how the individual's experience is impacting and where the stuck points are, if you will, right? That we can target so that we can help them get past these stuck points and reclaim agency over their life. So when we're talking about memory reconsolidation, and some of you may be familiar with this word, for some of you it might be new, but all it is, it's a natural process that happens all the time. Your brain's doing it right now. So when we have an experience, and obviously as a baby, everything's new, right? So the brain's taking all the information from the senses, the tones what you hear, what you smell, what you taste, what you feel, and it's putting together this network of like the really synaptic connections that are firing and wiring together to make sense of what's happening outside of me. And as you can imagine, as a kid, anything is possible, but the more they repeat, the more we form this default network. That's what we call the default mode, about how I interpret the world versus how you interpret the world. It's what makes us different. But that memory trace network, every time something reminds you of that, it opens up again and it's susceptible to change. So the brain updates the information by activating it. Oh, this is a water bottle. I have a certain amount of experiences with it. And then maybe one day my kid pours the water bottle on me. Now, water bottle has a new experience that's going to also be recorded with that memory trace so that next time I know what's possible, right? Keep the water bottle upright because it could spill and it gets wet. So it's like a simplified way of explaining it, but every time we recall information, our brain's going to update it. So you've been to trainings before, you've been to webinars before, but maybe you haven't been to one where I'm talking. So your brain opens up the memory of a webinar, and now you also have this information of when Steph talked about CMI. Now, how important it becomes depends on how much our interaction happens, right? So if I never see you again and you never look at CMI again, it'll kind of forget probably over time. But if from here you take the training, it's going to solidify more. Oh, this is important. This is something that we really need to include in our sense of the world. But it includes all of these factors like what you see, your sensations, what you're experiencing inside, the meaning you give it. And the reason why I feel that sometimes we miss some things is because with different approaches, we tend to target certain things. So, for example, I was trained in somatic experiencing, and it's a wonderful modality for people who really struggle with like the nervous system regulation, right? But it didn't quite target like the cognitions or the images or so this is one factor and it's very effective here, but some of the people that I was working with, it was way too slow and they couldn't focus. So that's where we needed a different approach. So this is very valuable, but it's not everything, right? So we wanted something that'll let you know how do you follow the brain and how do you decipher what approach is what that individual needs. And what's fascinating is the body will show you. That's the beauty of it. So what does it look like in a session? So if a person, let's say as a clinician prior to CMI, an individual would come, a client would come and tell me, hey, this is the situation. What I might do is teach them how their perspective impacts how they're responding. So we might work on like thinking errors, for example, how to change your thinking or how to look at it a different perspective. Maybe we might identify maladaptive responses like, oh, you go into fight or flight, but that's no longer working for you. Let's learn how to control your nervous system so you don't go into fight or flight. So we teach them breathing techniques and regulation techniques, understanding their nervous system. And really, most of the target typically with conventional approaches is to alleviate the symptoms or alleviate the pain, right? Neutralize or desensitize. And that's as far as it would go a lot of times. Sometimes it was really pivotal in the individual's perspective of life in themselves. Like it would change everything about, but it wasn't consistent, right? So what I found is, especially working in residential treatment with at-risk youth, these kids that came from really horrific trauma backgrounds, and they'd be in treatment for like a year, 2 years, and they did like phenomenal change, fantastic outcomes. But the moment they left and they went back to the environment, they seemed to regress. And a lot of the kids that we treated that succeeded ended up back in prison. They ended up for different offenses. But I always wondered, what is it that we're doing wrong? Where are we missing the mark? And so essentially with these approaches, we're trying to outcompete, right? What the nervous system is doing. Hold up, I just accidentally opened that. And we're providing tools for managing responses. This is very valuable. I don't want to undermine the importance, right, of having tools, coping strategies, uh, techniques to regulate our emotions, bring awareness to the way we think. Those are very, very important tools, but they are limited tools because they're meant to manage, not resolve, right? So what we're trying to do with CMI is to update those experiences, bring into awareness those experiences. And our motto is like, don't explain, experience, is go through and find out where is this response rooted in? What was the experience that led to me responding that way? And how do I update that policy procedure manual, if you will? Now, talking about it oftentimes takes us out of the experience. And so that's why with CMI, we really are, it's more internal. We're guiding them through it. It's visualization and it's connecting to what's happening in your body as you go through it. Because of that, it goes a lot faster. I've had people do CMI in a period of like 4 minutes where they're coming in, they're panicking about something, they've been stressed about it all week, and just by guiding them through the process, all of a sudden they're like, this thing isn't even an issue. I know what I need to do. I've done it before. It's not a problem. And it's pretty amazing how quickly that can happen. Now, of course, you might have some individuals that have deeply rooted um, responses where it takes more time. So maybe the average time for a CMI for to go from start to finish might be about 20, 30 minutes, 40 minutes. Oftentimes we do, a couple of rounds in one session, depending on the individual and how much. Sometimes it's just one and they need time to process and continue to integrate all the information. If we have particularly complex trauma situations where the individual's nervous system is also uh, part of like maybe they can't tolerate certain things, then it's going to really slow down the process. But we're using the same pattern to help rewire the nervous system essentially. So that's what I love about this. It's a very once you understand like the map or the pattern, you can use it both like very quickly and efficiently or over time. It's kind of like a, what do you call it? Like a compass, right? Which direction to go. The goals in this approach is to use the therapist as a resource for connection. So I know that we all hear throughout school and our training how the relationship is the biggest agent of change, right? That regardless of the intervention that the therapist uses, the relationship is what makes this effective. I heard Vander Kolk once say, it can't be the relationship because, the individual comes in, I ask him about his week, and he doesn't care about mine. He's not asking me about mine. That's not what we mean by relationship. We mean how we relate to. So essentially, if an individual comes in my office and they feel safe and connected, they then relate to me as a place of safety and connection. If I'm uh let's say triggered, we use the word trigger, right? By something that they're sharing and my blocks go up or about something, a response comes up, my nervous system, doesn't matter what I show on my face, it doesn't matter if I control my tone of voice, my nervous system won't lie, and their nervous system will detect that. So with BMI, we start off in foundations, we start off in getting to know ourselves as a human being, as clinicians, as human beings first, to be aware of when our signals, right? Learn how to navigate through our own signals so that we can maintain that space of safety and neutrality to provide that so that the client can relate to that through the process as they work through. So we're using the therapist as a resource. You are the primary intervention, right? But not in the way where you know the answers, rather in the way you're holding the space for them. We develop awareness of signals. So understanding how emotion or sensation or these responses that we have are all signals and learning how to explore them. So bringing awareness to those. And this piece is the experiential piece that probably is different from like, for example, I used to do ART and we were trying to clear and alleviate the sensations and the emotions. We're doing the opposite with CMI. We're actually expanding and exploring them because it's an important carrier of a message that is really important for us to understand more about ourselves and about our capacities and how we interpret experience. And so this was probably the biggest challenge for me in working this way was I was used to immediately like doing some eye movements or doing some metaphors to clear out discomfort. We actually move towards the discomfort. I'm telling you, this makes a world of difference, huge difference, because what we're seeing is increased resiliency, increased understanding of self, more empowered sense of self, right? Because we know what this is. This is a message for me. It's not something to be avoided. And in fact, with this piece, a pivotal moment for me was when a client came in and told me, I actually welcome flashbacks now, which about threw me out my chair because I thought, I never imagined somebody would say that, but he had grown such a solid sense of self that these like flashbacks were no longer siphoning him into a different reality, into a past experience. He was able to stand here, observe that, experience the discomfort that came with it, confront it, change it, and integrate it on his own without having to have me there. And then we're connecting people to their core capacity. So we believe that everybody has the capacity to be able to create their own reality, to decide the meaning behind things, right? To tolerate or even embrace these signals that happen, the discomforts. But somewhere along the line, it was thwarted. It was like limited. And so we really moved towards and helping an individual see that they can do this. They have the power to do this. They have the ability to do this. As humans, we're pretty resilient and powerful. So we don't want to avoid, we want to explore and connect to that. And then integrate critical memories, which means these experiences that you have that you had shoved into the closet because you didn't want to look at because they were too uncomfortable, you're bringing them to awareness. Because even from behind that door in the closet, they're impacting how you interpret the world. It's affecting how you like see yourself and how you interact, the expectations you have on your partner, how you interpret experiences at work, all of that. Just because you shoved them down at the bottom of the closet doesn't mean that the brain is not using it as a reference point. And so you might as well bring it to awareness so that you know when your brain is interpreting from that lens and not from the present of what's happening right now. So that's the power of integration, because at that point I am fully aware of how I'm responding, right? And that my perception is going to be impacted by those experiences that I had, so that I can intentionally put that to the side and be present and look at this from like a clear lens. And we have an expanded sense of the core self. That's probably the biggest shift that I see differently is, I had another client who came in one time to my office, horrific trauma. I mean, sexual abuse since the age of 7, had several years of like use of meth, HIV positive, high risk sexual behavior, you name it, drug use, everything. And after working through, initially we started targeting like the nightmares and flashbacks, but even when that was gone, he hated himself. He couldn't stand what he had done. He was ashamed of his drug use. He was ashamed of all of these things that he had chosen. And as we switched over, we pivoted to using CMI. I remember the day he came in, sat on my couch, and said, I think I'm beginning to like myself, which I thought was just absolutely beautiful. It's those moments where your little therapist heart just like bursts. So this expanded sense, this appreciation for our journey is a huge thing that happens with CMI. Why do we start with the clinician? So, at the beginning, we're like foundations needs to be focused on us and as a human. And I don't know how many trainings you've been to, but when I go to a training, my brain is in like therapist mode. And I'm thinking of all the clients that could use this, or understanding this client or that client. And oftentimes I'm not in the how does this apply to me mode, because that's what we're trained, right? We're trained to be there for others. And so with CMI, it's so important for us to grasp how our own experiences, our own beliefs, our own relationship with discomfort, with pain, with emotion impacts how we interpret the interaction with the client. And the issue whenever we're not aware of our own signals is that we can misinterpret, what's happening with the individual. And these clients come in because they trust us because we're the professionals, and they listen to what we say oftentimes, even if we don't know what we're talking about, which sometimes I think that this is coming from there, but it's really coming from somewhere else. But I can only work with what the client is sharing with me, right? So in order to guide them through the internal journey, you have to have done it yourself. You have to go through it and understand how your own brain and your own experience connects and have those aha moments. And so with the results as a clinician without doing this is that there's the misattunement. You can accidentally, not intentionally, but unintentionally derail, or you can recreate some of those attachment wounds, that the client may have experienced because they're trying to explore this one thing. And if you don't agree with that thing, there's that self-rejection again. So these are the risks that happen whenever we're not attuned with ourselves, so that we can then separate our own signals from the client signals. whenever we integrate versus alleviate, and unfortunately, I think in our fields, we're looking at it from like the medical perspective. You know, you go to the doctor and you only go when you have a symptom. You don't go, a lot of people, at least I don't go do wellness visits all the time. Some of y'all might be better adults than me, but oftentimes by the time I go to the doctor, it's because there's a problem, right? It is the same thing that happens. We don't look for therapy whenever things seem to be going fine. We wait until things go bad, which is understandable, right? I myself, when I started this process, I mean, I'm fairly functional, right? Like I got my career, I got my family, you know, pretty stable. But as we went through development of CMI, we tested these tools on ourselves. We became curious about our own experiences. And boy, there was so many things that I didn't know about myself and I didn't know that I didn't know. And there was so many changes that happened, not just clinically, you know, in my practice, but in my personal life as a result of this process that I'm absolutely grateful for. So those things, you know, I share like in foundations as we do our work together as clinicians. But the biggest piece is instead of trying to shove and forget experiences, we're bringing them to awareness and changing them the experience with it, the attachment to it, or the meaning behind it. And so this results in this expanded sense of self. I can't tell you how much more appreciation I have for all of my experience, both those that would be considered traumatic. I actually see the beauty in my whole journey, which then impacts how I approach someone else who's going through some of those things. I think more recently, I've been asked to speak to some individuals that are struggling with they're DACA recipients and I'm Mexican, I'm Hispanic, my parents were first generation. So if I had not had the tool to integrate my own experiences, I could come in and just have some kind of agenda, right? Or reaction to that. But I feel very differently approaching that and guiding individuals because I have this tool that has helped me understand how my own experiences are impacting like my drive and my interpretation of what's going on. Um, what this leads to is improved well-being. Why? Because when we feel like we have control over our lives, like we have the ability to choose, that is the only true freedom. Any of you like familiar with Viktor Frankl's work? I love Viktor Frankl. I think he brings so much wisdom to us. And he went through arguably one of the most horrific experiences that a human being can endure. And yet he brought so much wisdom from it. So he talks about how the only freedom as humans is our capacity to choose our response in any circumstance. And we know that from a cognitive level, but from an experiential level to go through it, you really feel that empowerment. You feel that expansion, that understanding. And this is what causes that well-being. So that now when the next difficult situation comes, because life is difficult, it doesn't derail me, right? I'm like, I've been here before. I know how to stand solid in who I am and allow that to guide my response. And so the result is I'm less stressed out. I'm not anxious about things. I might experience fear, but it doesn't get stuck into panic, right? So these are the things that you can go through. And so then the symptoms go down naturally because you become bigger than that. So I had one individual, another individual who also had horrific trauma, also had drug addiction, and he wrote. I asked him like, what would you, as he was discharging and completing treatment, you know, if you were to give any advice to future clients, like what are some of the things in your experience that you have learned? Because I love learning from my clients too. And he actually went back and wrote a whole pamphlet on CMI and how this made such a difference for him and his self-concept. And he said, I had lost my soul or was so far away from it that I couldn't feel it. Therapy gave me tools, 12 steps gave me hope, and CMI created a path home. And it's seeing people go through and explaining their own experience to me is the biggest evidence, you know, testament as to how this works because we're not the one with the answers. We're simply familiar with the path of getting those answers, and we can then guide our, you know, our clients through that. Another individual who initially I started with ART, you know, we were erasing images, doing positive scenes. Over time, she wanted to revisit those things and she could hold the space for herself. And she said, Steph, I think it's like She said, I feel grateful for these. And it was horrific experiences she went through. She had actually been hunted like by a child predator as a child from ages 8 to 9, and she lived in a different country. But she said as she went through it this time, after we've done CMI, she said, I could see it play out. And this little self was telling me, go rescue her. And she said, no, she needs to go through this. She said, I could feel her terror, I could feel her pain, and yet I was at peace. Right. And the I that was at peace was the observer I, what we call the core self, that could observe all of these human experiences that she went through that are part of her journey, and yet they don't derail her. They don't pull the rug from under her. She maintains her agency, even in facing some of the darkest experiences that she had. And I thought, this is just powerful. Another piece that really like solidified this as important work. So, what does it look like to be trained in CMI? Well, right now it's me and Brian run most of the trainings. We have a third person that is now becoming a trainer, Diana out of Florida. But we kind of split it up into two parts. And we wanted to make sure we made this training accessible for clinicians. And we all know it's hard to leave a private practice for a whole week to get trained. So we considered like traveling and all of these things. So we split it into two parts. So part one is the foundations, and we do that live via webinar. Now in foundations, you're learning kind of the basics of CMI, the structure of it. You watch a couple videos of sessions, but more importantly, you experience a session, and it's facilitated by the trainer or by an assistant that is well versed in the intervention, because we want you to know how it goes real time. Oftentimes, when you're just watching videos, you're like, yeah, well, that was a good session that went cleanly, but what happens when it goes south? And we find that the experience itself is going to be the best way of better understanding those concepts. But when you leave foundations, we're hoping that you have a basic understanding of the terminology, of kind of the goals and the structure of it. And more importantly, how you've started to get curious about your own experiences and maybe even some of the areas that you're limited in. You're able to benefit from this. And then we do clinical applications in person, 2-day training. And most of the time we've done the clinical applications either here in the Phoenix area, we've done a lot in Tampa, and a lot in Utah, because we have locations there. But if you have a couple people in your area that are interested in CMI training and are able to take it, we're more than happy to come to you. Julia, our designated adult person, is the one that helps facilitate and make that happen. But that's the clinical application. In that 2-day training, that's when you start applying it to other cases, right? What would it look like if you have an individual with complex trauma versus like a one-time event, or an individual that comes in that says, I just feel like the one that I had yesterday. She said, I'm doing yoga. I cured all my panic attacks. I'm a specialist in, like, she does oil therapy, and she's like, I meditate every day. I do all of these things and I'm pretty stable, but I feel like I haven't gotten to the root. There's something in me, and this is the one that didn't have a good solid sense of self. Perfect candidate for CMI. Um, so we're able to kind of do a lot more case conceptualization and help teach you how to integrate these other experiences. Like if you have training in IFS, or ART or EMDR, or any of those typical trauma modalities, we're able to help you better understand how you integrate those approaches in with CMI, or vice versa. Um, we had an individual who actually specializes in IFS that got trained a few months ago, and he actually just ran a webinar last month on how he takes, his approach to the next level with CMI. So that was beautiful. He was able to integrate the two and did a webinar on it. And that's what our hope is to not just, when we talk about integration, it's not just about the approach, it's our whole belief about us as professionals working together, collaborating and sharing is going to help us achieve our goals much more efficiently, and take this much further, because I think that we need that more in our field. So for more information, of course, you can contact Julia or you can email us. But I'm going to go ahead and pause this, stop this, so that we can give an opportunity for any questions you guys might have.